so much. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Tamsin Russell. I work at the Museums Association in my working life, and then I volunteer for Heritage Volunteer Group, one of my five different volunteering roles across the sector. And I'm a member of the executive board, but also I work really closely. It's nice to see we've got some of our delivery group here, work with Ben Marsh, who is co-chair of our inclusion delivery group at HVG. In terms of a visual description, I am a 50-year-old white woman with a really blunt fringe, black glasses, and sort of like an orangey, tomatoey ready lipstick with a blue top on, with a nice sort of blue background with stripes. And my pronouns are she and her. Now, we've got about 45 minutes, 50 minutes together to talk about creative and inclusive culture. Now, what I would let you know to begin with is, as a blunt indicator about how you change organisational culture, a rule of thumb is for every 10 years an organisation has been in existence, it takes 1 year to change the culture. So first of all, we're not going to be able to change the culture of your organisation in the next 50 minutes. And depending how long your organisation has been established, it may well take a much longer time frame. But what I do know about changing a culture is that it can happen and every little helps. So as long as you're making progress, the positive impacts of those cultural changes will be experienced by different people, and that can only be a good thing. Also, I know about when you're thinking around changing an organisational culture, the whole idea of creating a perfect culture is a nonsense. So what we are focusing on now and over the next 45 minutes is around creating an inclusive culture within your organisation, if you're lucky, but within your practice more specifically. The session is being recorded, so if you feel as if you need to do some more reflection or take things slightly slower, you can use the film to enable you to do that. So you can come back in and say, oh, do you know what? Actually, there's quite a lot that everyone was talking about, and I'd just like to re-engage with this material. Equally, you can use the film to watch with others within your organisation so that you're all on the same page around what your journey is going to be in terms of creating this culture. The session's going to be a bit of a mix between me giving some information and insight to you then discussing it with other people on this call. So we've got 2 breakout sessions, but we will also have time at the end for anybody to ask any questions, and also just really to highlight that we do have something called an inclusion forum. So that happens every month, usually but not always, after one of these monthly events. And that really is a space for you to continue to ask questions around inclusive volunteering, inclusive practice. And the reason we've put that monthly forum in is that we know that this area of work moves quite quickly. It's also complex, and you may find yourself in a situation that you have never been in before, and therefore you may want to get some support or signposting or advice from others who may have been in a similar but not necessarily exactly the same situation. So the reason that inclusion is so important in general, but specifically to HVG's practice, is it is one of our core values. So we have 5 core values, one of which is around being inclusive. To support the delivery of this value, we have an inclusion delivery group, and they meet on a quarterly basis to discuss a variety of aspects of work that we can be doing to support our membership. We run 3 inclusion workshops. So we've got inclusive cultures, that's today, inclusive recruitment, which I delivered in May, so you can see that, and it's been filmed, and then measuring diversity. And they're all interlinked. There isn't necessarily a particular order that you need to go through those. It really just does depend on what your challenge is within your own organisation. I've already highlighted the inclusion forums monthly. And we also have a Trello board. And this Trello board is essentially a hub of information, materials, research, case studies that relate to all the different protected characteristics that are legally protected via the Equality Act. So we are absolutely committed to inclusion, and this is how we do it. A most recent commitment to inclusion was our response to the riots over the summer. So a lot of our inclusion work came as a function of the murder of George Floyd in May 2020. And whilst other organisations were putting out statements, but not necessarily following through with action, we made a decision we were going to follow through with action and no statements. However, in this particular situation, we felt following the attack in Southport and then also the ensuing far-right riots, that was really important to acknowledge and respond to what we were seeing. So this was on our website, and I've included it in the slide deck, and you will get a copy of the slides afterwards. We felt it was important to highlight our commitment to this and our response to this and our condemnation of this. And what I would say is, if you are working in an organisation that hasn't been as forthright around this type of response or comments around hostile environments or Black Lives Matter or whatever it might be, you can always piggyback on the comments and statements of other organisations. So if you do need a point of influence within your own organisation, you can cite us as saying this is a really important area of work. You know, you can cite other organisations that have commented on good inclusive practice and use us as the influencers on your behalf. So what are we going to be doing today? We've got five different aspects of work that we're going to go through. So we're going to start with why is this important? And I'm going to talk about four different, I suppose, arguments in inverted commas. I'm then going to get you to sort of reflect on organisational culture and the culture of your own organisation and whether it lends itself to being inclusive or not. I'm then going to give you a brief sort of talk through to ask you individually to reflect on whether your organisation measures up in terms of what does inclusive practice look like. And I'm going to use HVG as an example. And then I'm going to talk you through just some steps, just 5 steps, you'll be pleased to know. I mean, there could be far more, but I'm just going to focus on 5 steps around starting your journey. It says questions and answers at the end, and we'll absolutely provide time to do that. But feel free, if and when a question comes into your brain, to pop it in the chat function, just in case we can't get to your question at the end, but also so that you're not having to remember the question you wanted to ask. Okay, so it's much better that it's in the chat function as well, so you can just experience the rest of the workshop. So why is it important? A nice way of thinking about it, certainly for those individuals within your organisation that may be more focused on compliance rather than human beings, is that there is a legal imperative. So we have legislation that highlights the importance of inclusion, and that legislation is the beautifully crafted Equality Act 2010. The Equality Act has 3 primary aims: to eliminate unlawful discrimination, harassment and victimisation, advance equality of opportunity between people who share a protected characteristic and those who don't, and foster good relations between people who share protected characteristics and those who don't. Now, I've worked in this area of practice probably for about, probably about 15 years or so, if not longer. And what I see consistently is a focus on aim 1, or the duty of 1, which is eliminating unlawful discrimination, harassment and victimisation, which I think is absolutely critical, but it is coming in a way from a negative perspective. So when you are thinking about inclusive procedures and policies, inclusive practice, the legal requirements are really important, but please don't forget the duty of 2 and 3, which is around advancing and fostering good relationships. Those can be a far more sort of positive going to in terms of inclusive practice, as opposed to moving away from something that's unlawful. So you can see the subtle difference between something that might be seen as more positive or less compliant. Number one is all about compliance. Number 2 and 3 is more around the human condition. So the Equality Act has 9 protected groups. And so you may be working in an organisation that only thinks around those 9 protected groups and doesn't think more broadly about other groups at all. But you might be in an organisation that looks at those 9 protected groups, but also then expands those to include other groups that might be marginalised or excluded, but aren't currently protected by legislation. So an example for that, the one that's probably most commonplace around this would be around concept of class and socioeconomic background. So being working class and being poor are not protected groups in the eyes of the law, but lots of organisations in the cultural sector have identified that it's often those 2 characteristics that have impacts on participation and connection. So they themselves may look to support and include those groups over and above the legal requirement. And the legislation is really clear. It talks about the responsibilities organisations have based on 3 different aspects: being a policymaker, a service provider, and an employer. So I'm using the word employer here, but obviously when you're a volunteer, you're not employed. However, under this legislation, there is still a requirement as a policymaker and a service provider to ensure that we are adopting good inclusive practice from a legislative perspective. Why else is it important? So we've got that legal framework. That can really, really help when you're trying to influence people that just don't see the human beings, but do see the risks associated with lack of legal compliance. But what we also have is a driver around ethical considerations. So an ethical consideration is a standard of behaviour associated with good practice, and in this instance, inclusion. So it's a collective understanding of what we should be doing as a group. And I've identified 3 examples of organisations that have their own code of ethics that may well also inform the work that you do. So the Museums Association Code of Ethics for Museums, of course, I would say that because I work at the MA. ICOM's Code of Ethics exists and was republished about 2 years ago. The Association of Zoos and Aquariums is the American organisation, but they do have a dedicated code of ethics. But for everybody else that might work in the space within Britain and Ireland, they have really good policies, but they don't have a defined code of ethics. They have a code of welfare, a code of conservation, which is really great, but they just don't have it in a single place. So you might want to have a look at ethical guidelines, standards of practice, codes of conduct. They have very different terminologies in the type of organisation or collection type or heritage organisation you work in, and also maybe of the organisations you work in partnership with. Why else is it important from a moral perspective? So we all have our own individual principles, our own individual beliefs and values, and those guide the decisions that we make. So as an individual in this space, you might be saying, well, of course we should be doing inclusive practice. That's exactly what we do. To really top and tail the concept of legal is also business. So where you are trying to influence internally based on an ethical or moral argument, you might find you're not getting any traction. So the legal argument can be really helpful. Well, this is against law. But equally, you might be able to get some traction and some influence if you talk about the business benefits. Okay, so the business benefit of inclusive practice. The business benefit of inclusive practice is that you might attract more people. And that could be volunteers or employees or visitors. You could retain those people. You have got greater representation and therefore diversity of thought, which innovates practice. that means that you're more relevant, that has an impact on your reputation, that attracts people from different other groups. So the concept of the pink pound or the purple pound. So people from LGBT communities that might have a higher disposable income than others, or the purple pound, the pound associated with money associated from groups or families where there is a disability. So there are a variety of reasons why inclusive practice is important: legal, ethical, moral, and business. Use whichever argument enables you to affect change in your organisation, okay? And you might need to use different arguments for different people, and we'll come on to stakeholder analysis shortly. When we talk about inclusive practice or inclusive cultures, I think the majority of the time I see people talking about this is around how do we get recruitment right, Tamsin? How can we attract a field of candidates who would want to come and volunteer with us? How can we make sure that we appoint volunteers that will demonstrate their local community? So there seems to be a real obsession on these two elements, okay? I think that's fine. And if this is something you're interested in, please attend our workshop on inclusive recruitment, but it's only part of the picture. If you only focus on those two things, in my experience, that's fine, but you then get people from diverse backgrounds hitting your organisation that may well not be up to speed around other good practice aspects around inclusive behaviours. So whenever you're thinking around creating an inclusive culture, you can't just say, well, I'm going to get the recruitment and selection bit right, and that's going to be fine. You have to take a step back and say, okay, when I have a volunteer here, what are the touch points in terms of different processes and policies? Who else are they going to meet as part of their time with us? And how can I make sure that at every point where they might go through a procedure or a process, or they might meet somebody in the canteen or in the staff room, however big your organisation is that they are going to experience inclusion rather than exclusion? You know, and we've got some of these examples. So some of the conversations we've had at our inclusion forum have been sort of really real case examples about volunteers misgendering others. So a volunteer that has transitioned and is now a woman, other volunteers still using their dead name or using the wrong pronouns or the wrong salutations. You know, these things happen. It does take a wee while sometimes for people to get used to changes in others, but if it's a consistent and malevolent and conscious decision, that's unacceptable. We've had examples from our inclusion forums of volunteers using racial slurs to describe other groups of volunteers and also visitors. We've had volunteer coordinators and supervisors not wanting to advertise with particular groups or communities. So this sort of exclusion and this discrimination can come from a variety of different quarters, okay? It doesn't always come from other volunteers or the members of public or the trustees up here. It can come from a variety of places. So we know why it's important. We know how we can try and use why it's important to influence others. But what do we mean by organisational culture? So this is your first breakout. So you're going to have 10 minutes to talk about organisational culture in your organisation. And here are some prompts. So what do we mean, or what do you mean, or what do you understand by organisational culture? And how would you describe the culture of your organisation? So I've just put in a few suggestions. You know, is it functional or dysfunctional? Discuss. Top down, bottom up, command and control. Is it a meritocracy? So actually the culture is really egalitarian and everyone is supported based on their contribution, or are they very market driven? So actually all they care about is the bottom line. Okay, I don't mind what you do, but as part of this breakout, please introduce yourself and just begin to have a conversation about the organisational culture in your organisation. and what that might mean from an inclusive practice perspective. So, Rhiannon, if you could put people into their groups, and then we'll also stop recording at that point.
We're good to go, Tamsin?
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. I know you just had 10 minutes beginning those discussions, and what I really would do is encourage you to carry on having discussions with whoever is within either your organisation or your local area. If you're part of one of the HVG regional volunteer networks, perfect opportunity to continue these discussions, at the Inclusion Forum that will be starting at 4:15 at the end of today. But do carry on these discussions. There are a variety of typologies or categories to describe organisations. I just kept it very sort of light touch here for you. But hopefully you've had a chance to think about, well, how is what is your organisation? What's the culture? How would you describe it to somebody that says, oh, in the pub, what's the culture of your organisation? I'm sure it happens all the time. And the reason it's important to understand your organisational culture is it enables you to work out how you can capitalise on that culture and use it to your advantage. If I give you a really good example, so Tesco's many moons ago, we're talking about 35 years ago, I'm showing my age now probably, they had a new edict, which was that from a particular Monday in September, for example, that from that day forward, everybody would just be called by their first name. Previous to that, if you were a manager, you were a Mr. or a Mrs., more likely a Mr. And then it moved to everybody was first names. Now, the culture at that point was a really strong command and control culture. So everything came from on top. And so whilst the culture they wanted to get to was far more informal and personable and human, which was about Rhiannon and Tamsin as opposed to Mrs. Russell, etc., they capitalized on their existing culture. So their existing culture was top-down command and control. So they then sent a memo in no uncertain terms that said, from Monday, the 1st of September, everybody will be called by their first name. So they were capitalizing on an existing culture to make a future cultural change. How elegant is that? So understanding your organizational culture can really help you identify how you're going to capitalize on existing processes and behaviors. And also, what do you or might you need to do to change where you need to get to? So you were focusing on breakout one. I also then added in some other broadcast aspects. So breakout one plus. So, is your organizational culture helping or hindering your inclusive practice? Or what could you use for it? What else do you think needs to be put in place? And also, how can we help? So it's sort of any reflections. I'm not going to get sort of death by feedback now, but sort of any reflections in terms of anything that HVG could help you with. Could we produce a document, a resource guide? Could we come and talk to your organizations, capacity permitting? We are here to help you on your inclusion journey. Completely, we are. And anything that came out of the conversations that you had, feel free to share those in the chat function, and we'll save those at the end. But understanding your organizational culture is really important. And what do we mean by organizational culture? So if you're looking at any set texts around this, an organizational culture is, or a culture in general, is around ideas, customs, and social behaviors. So we often talk about, a national or nation's culture rather than an organization's culture, but it's been co-opted by organizational psychologists and managers and leaders to describe how an organization functions as well. And it's still the same. So it's still about the ideas, it's still about the customs, i.e. what do we do? And it's still about the behavior. Somebody that's written extensively about culture is Edgar Schein. And Edgar Schein wrote extensively about culture and the taxonomy of organizational culture. And he proposed a particular model to try and make sense of how you see organizations. So I've called it Edgar's onion, because essentially it describes layers that you might see in an organization. And he talks about core beliefs, artifacts, not really helpful in heritage space. He doesn't mean like archaeological stuff we've got from the floor. and behaviors. So here's a visual depiction, very high tech, you can see, a visual depiction of Edgar's onion. So he says an organization has at its heart its core beliefs. Now, sometimes there has been drift from the core beliefs of how an organization has been established, and people lose sight or lose focus. But ultimately, it's what does the organization stand for? And often we might see that as the values that it articulates, or its articles in its charitable status, all of those sort of things. So it's the core purpose and belief of an organization. And then how it's manifested is in artifacts. So an artifact is something that's tangible that we can see. So if I give you an example, if one of the core beliefs of your organization is environmental responsibility, okay, an artifact we might see is a policy on environmental sustainability. We might see renewable energy processes. We might see solar panels on the roof of my organization. Those are all artifacts. So they are physical, tangible demonstrations of the ultimately core beliefs of an organization. And then what we experience on a day-to-day basis are the behaviors of the people within the organization. So again, using that analogy, environmental sustainability and responsibility is my core belief. I've got all these other things. But what I might see in my colleagues and co-workers and volunteers is somebody switching the lights off at the end of the day and making sure they fully close down their computer. So when you are thinking, and don't worry, I'm not going to get you to talk about your own organizations, but when you're thinking around your organization, what might be helpful is to say, to what extent has there been drift between what the organization stands for, what you're seeing, i.e. I've got a policy on it, and that's often an organization espousing a commitment, but actually it's the behaviors that tell you whether they're really doing it or not. It's that gap. Essentially, I call it a lip service gap between what the organization says it's doing, core beliefs and artifacts, and what it's actually doing, behaviors. And often there's a disconnect. Again, in your organization, if your organization has a policy on EDI, has a policy on inclusive recruitment, has a value in its strategic framework, has a mention of it in its vision, those are all good things because you can use those things to affect change. So you might say, I'm really surprised we're not sending interview questions out in advance of any interview or selection event that we're running for our volunteers, when it does say in our organisational mission that we want to support inclusive practice. So you use the structures, and what they've said is important for your own success or for the change you want to see. Within the concept of organisational cultures, there are other things that you might want to reflect upon. So there might be subcultures. And so these would be the cultures of individual teams or functions or departments. These are often created as a function of whoever's in charge. So this is where you get those inconsistencies in organisations, where you might find a particular department is far more inclusive than another department. It's probably because the department that has a manager that doesn't value inclusion is blocking it. Does that make sense? So again, even if your whole organisation can't move along with this journey, think about how you can create subcultures within the teams that you function, so that at least you as a minimum are being inclusive, because it is all about critical mass. It's not always top down, it's often bottom up. Other terminology that I think is helpful to acknowledge is this concept of climate. And I don't mean climate crisis, but this is a far more ephemeral, a transient experience. So our statement about the far right riots is a response to a particular point in time, which meant that the climate within the UK was far more hostile and excluding, and therefore we couldn't change the culture of the whole of UK, but what we could do is respond to that particular point. So there's a concept of culture that lasts for a long time. That's why it takes 1 year for every 10 years an organisation has been in existence, but a climate is slightly more transient and ephemeral. So what do we mean by inclusive culture? I'm just going to go through these quickly, just some definitions. So inclusion is the action or state of including or of being included within a group or structure. Shocker. Inclusion is the practice or policy of providing equal access. And that doesn't mean the same access, okay, but it's a quality of access to opportunities and resources from people who might have otherwise been excluded or marginalised. And part of this is about identifying which groups these are for your organisation and your location. An inclusive culture is one that embraces and celebrates all of those differences in experience and backgrounds and ways of thinking, and is open to those conversations. An inclusive volunteering culture by that nature is relating to the organisation's commitment to the policy they have, the practices that we talk about, the experiences, the behaviours of volunteers within the sector more broadly. So again, just think about what are your priorities in your organisation. So I'm going to pause there for a moment. I have a couple more slides I'd like to go through, but I'm really conscious that people might have a couple of questions or reflections. I'm absolutely fine from things that we've said so far. I'm going to keep the slide deck on, so there's not a ramble or a rush to get it back online. But does anyone have any questions about anything that we've talked about so far, or any observations?
There are a few in the chat, Tamsin.
Is that all fabulous? Oh,
have a little look at.
I am.
There was an interesting kind of parity in discussion between a couple of groups around the sort of disconnect and the lip service. So several groups spoke about that.
Yep.
And then Jess has put a plea out for repeating the nugget you mentioned right at the very start about how long it takes to change the culture.
So I really wish I could cite it as well, but it was when I first did my organisational behaviour stuff. And in my organisational change module, it was highlighted by one of the academics that for every 10 years an organisation has been in existence, it takes a year to change the culture. So whether that is empirically sound, I don't know. But what I suppose what it tries to communicate is I think so often people go into an organisational change aspect and they think they're going to make a change overnight, and it just doesn't happen that way. I would hope through the advent of new technologies and changes, I suppose, in how organisations function, that might be accelerated now from that 30 years ago when I first started getting active in this space. But it's just basically to tell you that it takes a long time. So that's the nugget that was shared with me by an academic that works in organisational change. I'm just having a look to see if there's anything else. Thank you. Anything that's in this that we haven't or won't get a chance to answer, we will do.
There's a little bit about kind of a framework around involving refugees and asylum seekers that HVG could put together.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? I attended a fantastic event and presentation by the Scottish Refugee Council. I was blown away by it. So they have a framework, they have a presentation, and so we could either get them to come and speak or I can speak to them about it. But it was phenomenal. And they talk also in detail about the differences between refugees and asylum seekers and what that means for volunteering and all of those practices. So but yeah, and thanks Sheila for that question or reference around GEM. Brilliant. Lip service, yes, lots of lip service here. I've done that one.
Another one from Joy around kind of communicating that volunteering is also community engagement and audience development. It's not just about workforce and how we articulate the difference and the similarities, I guess, within our organisations.
Yeah, and we've talked at length in the inclusion and also inclusion forum fairly recently about what that means, and again using your arguments. So the argument would be if your organization wants to do lots of community engagement, actually talking about volunteering and volunteers as a population of that community engagement can be really good. You can absolutely get them to change their minds around volunteering or embrace it in a different way. But also there are considerations around that because if you are using volunteers as participants in a community engagement project, and those participants come from a marginalised and excluded background, there needs to be an acknowledgement that there might need to be more wraparound support and care for those volunteers as part of that, and also training and support so that the volunteer coordinators or managers or supervisors, however you describe them, are more fluent in working with people that have been marginalised or excluded or have experienced trauma. And again, I would suggest that organisations don't fully recognise the difference and the different requirements around that. Fabulous. Okay, I'm going to carry on, and we will save the chat. So anything that comes up in the chat, we'll get back to you on. So how does your organisation measure up? So, I mean, I've been talking about this as we go, but I would suggest that you do some individual reflection after today to think about your organisation's vision. You know, is there a representation of inclusivity in your organisation's vision? Do they explicitly state this? Same way in your organisation's mission, do they explicitly state something to do with inclusion? Do they put in inclusion, equity, equality, diversity? And also, if they do, that's great, but find out how they actually define it. Same with values. And again, that's where that lip service comes up. Strategic priorities. Is inclusion, again, represented in those strategic priorities? And here's one I made earlier for you. This is the HVG strategic framework. So our vision, transformative volunteering across the heritage sector, it doesn't have inclusion written there, but our mission is enabling heritage to realise the potential of volunteers transforming organisations' lives and communities. So we've got the community component in there. And then one of our 5 values is around being inclusive, and this is our commitment. So there's something about going in and saying, okay, well, it's not mentioned explicitly, but is it there implicitly? Or what can I use from my existing organisation's framework to move the organisation or the conversation on? Other individual reflection, I would say, is, again, within your organisation's strategy, do they have a dedicated strategy for equality or inclusion? Do they have a dedicated policy around those things? Are there procedures and practices that are included as part of your organisation? And I think for procedures, practices and policies, and to agree strategies, often they might have a variety of different names, but they still talk to this area of work. So it could be equality opportunity strategy if you're from the 1960s, or it could be respect and dignity policy if you're in the 1980s, or it could be inclusion, or it could be lived experience policy. So there might be policies and strategies that have a variety of different names, but actually still go to deliver ultimately the organisation's commitment. And if they don't, find out whether there are any going to be written in the future. And you might also find key performance indicators. So if any of your organisations are an NPO, so that's England-centric, guys, I'm sorry, have a look to see what their key performance indicators are as a national portfolio organisation. If you're in Scotland, have a look at the performance framework that's produced by Scottish Government. If you're a local authority, have a look to see if they've got any KPIs from the LGA or COSLA. Again, my experience is England and Scotland more than Wales and Northern Ireland, I'm sorry. But are there any key performance indicators identified and dictated by your own organisation or by funders? So I'm really conscious that we are coming to the end of our session, but for me, creating an inclusive culture is around understanding your organisation's existing commitment to inclusion, because understanding where you are can help you influence where you're going and ground your influence within those commitments. You reference them. They can't argue with their own data. One of my favourite phrases is if someone says, oh, I'd like to do this programme. Oh, you can't do it. But you said so in our mission. Key to understanding your organisation's explicit commitment to inclusion can also attract a more diverse volunteer base. So making sure that you are communicating that as part of your vacancy pack, part of your website, all of those things can mean that people feel more comfortable and willing to come and work with you, because they feel as if their back is backed up. You've got their back, you've got their lived experience, you appreciate them bringing different experiences, and actually they're going to be welcomed and nurtured and supported. So highlighting your organisation's commitment in any of those recruitment materials is really, really positive. And key message 3 really is understanding what you have in place and what you don't have in place enables you to hone good practice within your organisation. So what can you make better, or what can you deliver? And also understanding what you've got in place or what you don't have in place helps you measure success over time. So it is 4 minutes. I'm going to hand over to Rhiannon. But just to let you know, obviously inclusion isn't just for a 45-minute session on a Tuesday afternoon. In the slide deck you'll get, I've also got some more detailed ideas around how to start your journey, which is about reflecting on where you are as a professional. It's about identifying where your stakeholders are and the relationships you have. It's also about identifying what the blocks and barriers are. And you can really do that, or carrots and sticks. You can really do that by doing a review of any of your process flows. You know, where are they? Where do they sit? And then you can begin to develop a 6-month action plan, even though it will take you 1 year for every 10 years it's been around. Not really, but it does take a long time. So that leads me to the end of today's conversation. I'm now going to stop sharing my slides and just hand back to Rhiannon to close the event. But thank you very much for your contributions and your questions. Thank you.
A huge thank you to you, Tamsin. I personally always find these incredibly thought-provoking, and I go away with about 100 actions. So I hope you've written them all down if you're anything like me. We will get the recording out to you in due course, and obviously the slide deck as well. But most importantly, if you want to keep your EDI conversation, your EDI brain going a little bit longer this afternoon, please join us at 4:15. They are really lovely events. The inclusion forums tend to be a much smaller group, a little bit less formal, and we don't record them, so you can talk about things that perhaps haven't gone so well without fear of it being plastered on the internet anywhere. So please do join us. I popped the link in the chat. The other thing just to say then is we'll be back again in a month. So our next HVG events are on the 22nd of October. And a really good next session looking at the legalities around volunteering. You often don't hear the word legal and volunteer in the same word, but by virtue of that, there are quite a lot. So we will be exploring that with our colleague Sarah from the British Film Institute, and are followed by our inclusion forum at 4:15. So please join us for those. All details on the website. So if you're leaving us today, have a lovely rest of your Tuesday and a nice week. If you're joining us at 4:15,